Between July 1979 and May 1981, 28 children vanished from the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. Their bodies turned up in rivers, in abandoned buildings, in the woods, strangled, discarded, forgotten. A city paralyzed, a community terrorized, one man convicted. And to this day, the question that haunts every investigator, every family, every soul who dares to look closely at the evidence is this: did we catch the right person? Or did we simply close the file because closing it was easier than facing the truth? This is a true story. Good evening, I'm Julian Cross, and tonight we're opening a file that America tried to seal shut over 40 years ago, a file that even now refuses to stay closed. Before we begin, I need to ask something of you. We're a small channel just trying to reach 100 subscribers. If you found your way here tonight, if this story calls to you the way it calls to me, consider subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to us. And while you're here, drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel, how far the truth can reach. Now, let's talk about Atlanta. Let's talk about the summer of 1979. And let's talk about what happens when a city decides that image matters more than answers. Part 1. The beginning of the nightmare Atlanta, Georgia. July 1979. The city was thriving, or at least that's what the brochures said. The skyline gleamed. The politicians smiled. Atlanta had rebranded itself as the Black Mecca of America, a city where progress wasn't just promised, it was delivered. The first black mayor sat in office. Fortune 500 companies were moving in. The narrative was clear. Atlanta had moved past its painful history. Atlanta was the future. But if you walked through the neighborhoods on the South Side, if you knew the families living paycheck to paycheck in East Atlanta, if you spent any time in the communities near the Chattahoochee River, you knew a different truth. You knew that progress, like so many things, depended on where you stood. And for the poorest, the most vulnerable, the most forgotten, progress was a word that meant nothing when your child didn't come home. On July 28, 1979, 2 boys went missing. Edward Hope Smith, everyone called him Teddy, was 14 years old. Alfred Evans, 13, went by the nickname Q. They were friends, they were kids, and on that summer day, they disappeared. Their bodies were found together in a wooded area in southwest Atlanta. Teddy had been shot with a .22 caliber weapon. Both showed signs of violence, trauma that suggested fear, struggle, suffering. But here's the thing that should chill you. The police didn't connect it to anything larger, not yet. In a city where black children from poor neighborhoods went missing with uncomfortable regularity, 2 deaths didn't ring alarm bells. It was tragic, yes, but it wasn't unusual. So the case was filed and life went on. Except it didn't, because something had started. Something that wouldn't stop for 2 years. September 4th, 1979. Milton Harvey, 14 years old, left his home to run an errand for his mother. A simple errand. The kind of thing kids do every day. He never came back. His body wasn't found until November, weeks later, in a remote area, decomposed, discarded like refuse. October 1979. Yusuf Bell, just 9 years old, was asked by a neighbor to go buy snuff from a local store. He was a good kid, responsible. He said yes. Witnesses later reported seeing him get into a blue car. On November 8th, his body was discovered in an abandoned school building. He'd been strangled. Yusuf's mother was a woman named Camille Bell. Remember her name, because she's going to become important in ways the city's power structure never anticipated. By the end of 1979, 4 children were gone, 4 families were grieving. And still, Atlanta police treated each case as separate, isolated incidents. Random tragedies in a city of millions. But mothers know. Mothers always know. Camille Bell and other parents began to notice a pattern that the police refused to see. Young, black, male, poor neighborhoods. And then, gone. These weren't isolated tragedies. This was something deliberate, something hunting. They formed a group, the Committee to Stop Children's Deaths. They organized, they protested, they begged the city to pay attention. and for months they were ignored. Because acknowledging a pattern meant acknowledging something deeply uncomfortable, that Atlanta's most vulnerable children were being targeted, and no one in power had noticed or cared until the body count became impossible to dismiss. If this story is getting under your skin the way it gets under mine, hit that like button. We're aiming for 20 likes on this video. 20 people willing to say this matters. The truth matters. Let's see if we can get there. Part 2. The summer of 1980. When the city finally woke up. The spring and summer of 1980 brought a horror that could no longer be ignored. March, April, May, June, July. Every month, more children disappeared. More bodies were found. The Chattahoochee River began to feel like a burial ground. Wooded areas, abandoned lots, dumpsters behind shopping centers. The city was turning into a graveyard, and the victims, almost exclusively young, black, and poor, were being thrown away like trash. Earl Terrell, 10 years old, disappeared in July. Found days later strangled. Anthony Carter, 9 years old, same month, same fate. Clifford Jones, 13, found behind a shopping center in August, strangled, his small body left in the open like a message. And here's what makes this unbearable. Many of these children were known to social services. Many came from homes where poverty meant parents worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to survive. Some of these kids were vulnerable in ways that made them easy targets. Runaways, children involved in street economies. Kids who trusted the wrong people because they had no one else to trust. And someone, or several someones, knew this. Someone was exploiting that vulnerability with surgical precision. By July 1980, nearly a year after the first victims, the Atlanta Police Department finally created a task force. 5 investigators, that's it. 5 people to investigate what was, by then, 11 unsolved cases involving dead children. Think about that. 11 children, 5 investigators, and a city that still, even then, seemed more concerned with its image than with the truth. The national media began to take notice, and with the media came the pressure. Suddenly Atlanta wasn't the shining black Mecca anymore. It was the city where black children were being hunted. The city that couldn't or wouldn't protect its most vulnerable. Mayor Maynard Jackson, the city's first black mayor, found himself in an impossible position. He wanted to project competence, control, progress, but the bodies kept appearing. And the community, led by mothers like Camille Bell, was demanding answers he couldn't provide. The FBI joined the investigation in September 1980. Operation ATKID, Major Case 30. They brought resources, profilers, federal authority, and still the nightmare continued. October 1980, November, December, January 1981. Aaron Jackson, 9 years old. Found strangled on a riverbank. Patrick Rogers, 16. Pulled from the Chattahoochee River. Luby Geeta, 14. Disappeared in January 1981. Found in February. Another river victim. Terry Pugh, 15. Vanished. Found dead. By this point, the terror was absolute. Parents kept their children inside. Schools organized safety patrols. A community group called the Techwood Bat Patrol formed. Neighbors arming themselves to protect their kids because the police couldn't or wouldn't. Imagine living in that fear. Imagine being a parent in Atlanta in 1980, watching the news every night, wondering if your child would be next. Imagine being a child in that city, sensing the fear in every adult's eyes, knowing that something unspeakable was happening and no one could stop it. The national response was extraordinary, but also, in its way, deeply troubling. Celebrity fundraisers, psychics hired by tabloids, national rallies. Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra performed benefit concerts. It became a spectacle, a media event. The Atlanta monster narrative took hold. The idea of a single shadowy figure stalking children in the night. And while the spectacle raged, while cameras focused on celebrities and profilers and politicians, the real story, the story of systemic neglect, of economic desperation, of children made vulnerable by poverty and exploitation, that story got buried. Because monsters make for good television, Systemic failure doesn't. Part 3. The Bridge, the Arrest and the Trial That Changed Nothing, May 22, 1981. Just after midnight, police officers were conducting surveillance near the James Jackson Parkway Bridge in northwest Atlanta. They'd been staking out bridges over the Chattahoochee River for weeks, operating on a theory. The person responsible for the killings was using the river to dispose of bodies. And then, in the dead of night, they heard it. A splash. Moments later, a car crossed the bridge. The officers stopped it. Behind the wheel, Wayne Bertram Williams, 23 years old, black, a freelance photographer and aspiring music promoter. He told police he'd been driving around, looking for an address to meet a singer named Cheryl Johnson. He seemed nervous but cooperative. The police let him go. 2 days later, on May 24th, the body of Nathaniel Cater, a 27-year-old man, was pulled from the river downstream from the bridge. He'd been dead for days, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Wayne Williams became the prime suspect. On June 21, 1981, Wayne Williams was arrested and charged, not with the child cases but with 2 adult cases. The authorities charged him with the deaths of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, another young man found in the river. And here's what's critical. He was never charged with any of the children's cases. Not one, but the city and the nation had already decided. Wayne Williams was the Atlanta child perpetrator, the monster, the answer everyone had been desperate to find. The trial began in January 1982, and it became a masterclass in forensic overreach and prosecutorial zeal. The centerpiece of the case was fiber evidence. Investigators claimed they'd found fibers on 13 of the victims that matched materials in Williams' home and car. Yellow-green carpet fibers from his bedroom, violet acetate fibers from his bedspread, dog hairs from his German Shepherd. 3 experts testified that these matches were statistically significant. The prosecution argued that the bedroom carpet fiber was rare, appearing in only an estimated 82 out of over 600,000 homes in Atlanta. A 1 in 8,000 probability, they said. Astronomical odds. But here's what the jury didn't hear. That carpet wasn't nearly as rare as prosecutors claimed. It was standard builder-grade material used in suburban developments all over northwest Atlanta. Entire neighborhoods had it, and more damning still. The Chattahoochee River, where many bodies were found, ran right past a textile manufacturing facility. The river itself was contaminated with fibers. Defense experts would later demonstrate that a body dumped in that river could accumulate fibers that had nothing to do with the perpetrator. None of this was presented to the jury. Witnesses testified that they'd seen Williams with some of the victims before they died. But these testimonies were shaky at best. Identifications were uncertain. Timelines didn't align. And critically, there was no physical evidence, no blood, no DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon that directly connected Wayne Williams to any victim's death. Wayne Williams took the stand in his own defense, and according to trial transcripts, it was a disaster. He became combative under cross-examination, angry, defensive. He came across as arrogant, evasive. And juries don't like that. After 12 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty, February 27, 1982, 2 consecutive life sentences for the deaths of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. And then something extraordinary happened. Immediately after Williams' conviction, the Atlanta Police Department closed 22 additional cases, 22 child cases. They attributed them all to Wayne Williams, without charging him, without presenting evidence to a jury, without a trial, just closed. The official narrative became fixed. Wayne Williams did it, all of it. The Atlanta child perpetrator had been caught. The nightmare was over. The task force was disbanded. The city moved on. But the families, the mothers, the fathers, the siblings, they didn't move on. Because they knew something the rest of the world was only beginning to suspect. This wasn't justice. This was a performance, a political solution to a crisis that demanded real answers. And Wayne Williams, sitting in a cell, maintained his innocence. He still does. 43 years later, if you're still with me, if you're feeling what I'm feeling right now, that sense that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong with this story, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who cares about the truth. Because stories like this don't get told unless people like you make sure they're heard. Part 4. The evidence that didn't fit. Here's the question that's haunted this case for over 4 decades. If Wayne Williams did it all, why doesn't the evidence fit? Let's talk about victimology, the study of who the victims were and how they were chosen. The victims ranged in age from 7 to 27. Some were children living with stable families. Others were teenagers involved in street economies. Vulnerable, often exploited. Some were found in the river. Others in wooded areas. Some were strangled. At least one was shot. Some bodies showed signs of prolonged suffering. Others suggested quick, efficient ends. Serial perpetrators, real ones studied by the FBI for decades, develop patterns. They have preferred victim types, consistent methods. Ritual behaviors. They don't typically jump between children and adults, between strangulation and gunshots, between rivers and dumpsters. But the Atlanta cases showed massive variation, which suggests, at least to many experts, that we're not talking about one person, we're talking about multiple actors. John Douglas, you might know him from the Netflix series Mindhunter, was the FBI profiler who worked on the Atlanta case. He's one of the founders of modern criminal profiling, and he's gone on record multiple times saying this: Wayne Williams didn't commit all the cases attributed to him. Maybe some, maybe even several, but not all. In his memoir, Douglas wrote, "The police cleared the books of 24 or 25 cases they attributed to Wayne Williams." And in a 2019 interview, he said something even more chilling: "It isn't a single offender, and the truth isn't pleasant." The truth isn't pleasant. What did he mean by that? Let's talk about what investigators found but never fully pursued. Several of the victims were connected to a man named John David Wilcoxon. Wilcoxon was a truck driver who operated what investigators believed was a network, a ring, that exploited vulnerable children. Court records show that victims like Earl Terrell, Darren Glass and Luby Geeta had been at Wilcoxon's property or had contact with him or his associates. Wilcoxon had ties to known offenders, men convicted of harming children, and yet despite clear connections between these men and several victims, the investigation into this network was never completed. It was sidelined, buried. Why? One theory, and it's a theory but one supported by investigative reporting, is that this network had connections. Maybe to people with money, maybe to people with power, maybe to people who couldn't afford to have their names dragged into a public trial. And so, instead of unraveling a complex web of exploitation and potential complicity, authorities focused on one man. A black man with no power, no connections, no ability to fight back effectively. A man who could be convicted, imprisoned, and used to close the books. Convenient. But here's where it gets even darker. In 2019, investigative journalists uncovered documents showing that during the original investigation, law enforcement conducted a secret parallel investigation into possible Ku Klux Klan involvement in the cases. Yes, you heard that right, the KKK. According to declassified Georgia Bureau of Investigation documents, this investigation, internally referred to as the 8100 file, ran for 2 months in 1981. It examined claims that Klan members were responsible for at least some of the cases. An informant reported that Klansmen had expressed anger at one victim, Luby Geeta, after a go-kart accident. The informant claimed the Klansmen wanted to end him, that they talked about creating an uprising among the blacks by targeting children, 1 each month. The GBI director at the time, Phil Peters, explicitly ordered that this investigation be kept separate from the main task force. His reason? Fear that if it leaked it would possibly cause a race riot. Think about that. Evidence of possible racial targeting. Evidence that white supremacists might be involved, and it was hidden, kept secret, never presented to Wayne Williams's defense team, never disclosed to the jury. The KKK investigation ended 1 month before Wayne Williams became the prime suspect, and it was buried for nearly 40 years. Now, does that mean the KKK was responsible? Not necessarily. The theory has problems. The Klan in Georgia was heavily infiltrated by law enforcement. Operating covertly in black neighborhoods would have been extremely difficult. And historically, the KLAN claimed credit for violence. They didn't hide it. But the fact that this investigation existed and was concealed, that alone is a constitutional violation. It's exculpatory evidence that should have been disclosed. It's an alternate theory that should have been explored, and it wasn't, because closing the case mattered more than solving it. Part 5. The truth. The city didn't want. Let's talk about what was really happening in Atlanta in 1979. Atlanta wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. The first major American city with a black mayor. A beacon of racial progress. A place where the civil rights movement's victories had supposedly transformed into economic opportunity and political power. But symbols are fragile, and the Atlanta child cases threatened to shatter the illusion. Because here's what the cases revealed. Despite all the progress, despite the black political leadership, despite the gleaming downtown skyline, poor black children were still disposable. They were still vulnerable. They were still dying, and the system still didn't care enough to protect them. When Camille Bell and other mothers organized, when they demanded action, they weren't just fighting an unknown offender. They were fighting a power structure that had invested everything in the narrative of Atlanta as a success story. And their children's cases, unsolved, mounting, horrifying, were destroying that narrative. So the city needed an answer. Not the answer. Just an answer. Something that would stop the bleeding. Something that would allow life to return to normal. Wayne Williams provided that answer. One man, arrested, convicted, case closed. The fact that he was never charged with most of the cases didn't matter. The fact that the evidence was circumstantial and scientifically questionable didn't matter. The fact that alternate suspects and theories were never fully investigated didn't matter. What mattered was that Atlanta could say, "We got him. The children are safe. The city is secure. Move on." And most people did, but not the families, not the mothers who knew their children's cases didn't fit the pattern attributed to Wayne Williams, not the investigators who saw the inconsistencies but were told to stop asking questions, and not Wayne Williams sitting in a prison cell insisting year after year that he didn't do it. Part 6. The Modern Re-Examination and the Silence March 2019. Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the community. The city would re-examine evidence from the Atlanta child cases using modern DNA technology. It had been nearly 40 years. DNA science had advanced exponentially. Techniques that didn't exist in 1982 could now extract genetic profiles from degraded samples, from fibers, from microscopic traces. The families were cautiously hopeful. Maybe, finally, they would get answers. Maybe Wayne Williams would be exonerated. Or maybe he'd be definitively linked to victims he was never charged with. Either way, the truth would emerge. Evidence from approximately 30 cases was sent to Sorensen Forensics in Salt Lake City, a private laboratory specializing in degraded DNA analysis. And then, nothing. July 2021. Authorities announced they'd extracted DNA from 2 cases and were continuing analysis. October 2021. Mayor Bottoms stated that investigators had reviewed about 40% of the evidence. And then, silence. As of right now, as I'm recording this in late 2025, more than 4 years after evidence was sent to the lab, no public results have been released. None. In December 2022, families of victims held a press conference outside Atlanta City Hall. They were frustrated, angry, desperate. Catherine Leach, mother of victim Curtis Walker, said this. "No one has come forward and told me that Wayne Williams ended my child. Deep down in my heart, I know Wayne Williams did not end my child. But the city hasn't responded. The lab hasn't released findings. And the silence, the refusal to provide updates, to offer transparency, has fueled speculation. What did they find? Did the DNA exonerate Wayne Williams? Did it implicate him in cases he was never charged with? Did it point to other suspects, suspects whose names might be uncomfortable for the city to acknowledge? Or did the tests simply fail? Too much time, too much degradation, too little viable material? We don't know. And that's the point, because if there's one thing this case has taught us, it's that Atlanta, its institutions, its power structure, its desire to preserve a certain image, has never been fully committed to the truth, not in 1981, and maybe not now. Wayne Williams remains in prison. 43 years, 2 consecutive life sentences for 2 cases, 22 other cases attributed to him without trial. He's filed appeals, he's requested DNA testing, he's maintained his innocence. And the city has moved on. But the families haven't. The investigators who know the evidence doesn't all fit, they haven't moved on either. Because the dead don't rest when the living refuse to tell the truth. Part 7. What the evidence actually tells us. Let me be clear about something. I don't know if Wayne Williams is innocent. I don't know if he's guilty. I wasn't there. I didn't examine the evidence firsthand. I'm not a forensic scientist or a detective, but I can read, I can analyze, I can look at what's publicly available and see the contradictions. Here's what the evidence suggests. Not proves, but suggests. Wayne Williams likely had contact with some of the victims. The fiber evidence, despite its flaws, does indicate that materials from his home ended up on multiple bodies. That's not random. That's a connection. It's possible, even probable, that Williams was involved in some of the cases, maybe the adult cases he was convicted of, maybe a handful of others. The 2010 DNA analysis that matched hair from victim Patrick Baltazar to Williams with a statistical probability of about 5% among African Americans is significant. It doesn't prove guilt beyond all doubt, but it's evidence that can't be easily dismissed. But, and this is critical, the variation in victimology, methods, disposal patterns, and victim connections suggests that not all 28 to 30 cases were committed by the same person. The most likely scenario, based on available evidence and expert analysis, is this. Multiple perpetrators were operating in Atlanta during that period. Some victims were targeted by Wayne Williams, others were harmed by members of the exploitation network connected to Wilcoxon. Others still might have been victims of entirely separate actors, family members, acquaintances, opportunistic offenders. But acknowledging that would have required a far more complex investigation. It would have meant pursuing powerful people, unraveling networks, exposing institutional failures. It would have meant admitting that the problem wasn't one monster. It was systemic. And so the city chose the simpler story. One man, one trial, one conviction, 22 cases closed without charges, justice as theater. Closing. The file that won't close. Here's what keeps me up at night about this case. It's not just the tragedy of 28 lives cut short. It's not just the families left without closure. It's not even the question of Wayne Williams' guilt or innocence. It's what the case reveals about how we value truth. Because in 1982, when Wayne Williams was convicted and the cases were closed, the city of Atlanta made a choice. It chose narrative over investigation. It chose image over justice. It chose the comfort of a simple story over the discomfort of complex truth. And that choice, that willingness to close the book before the story is finished, it happens all the time. In cases big and small, in cities across the country. Whenever the truth is inconvenient, whenever it threatens the powerful, whenever it requires more effort than institutions are willing to give, the Atlanta child cases should haunt us. Not because they're uniquely evil, though they are horrifying, but because they're uniquely revealing. They show us in stark relief how justice works when the victims are poor, black, and powerless. How investigations end when the priority is containing a crisis rather than solving it. How convictions happen when the evidence is good enough for a narrative, even if it's not good enough for the truth. Wayne Williams may be guilty. He may be innocent. The DNA evidence still being analyzed may answer that question, or it may not. But guilty or innocent, one thing is certain. The full truth of what happened in Atlanta between 1979 and 1981 has never been told. The full investigation was never completed. The alternate suspects were never fully pursued. And 28 families, 28 mothers and fathers and siblings, are left with questions that no one in power seems willing to answer. So I'll end with this. If you've watched this far, if this story has affected you the way it's affected me, I'm asking you to do something. Subscribe to this channel, not for me, but because stories like this need to be told. The uncomfortable ones, the unresolved ones, the ones that don't have neat endings. Leave a comment. Share this video, talk about it. Because silence, institutional silence, cultural silence, our silence, is how cases like this disappear, how the dead are forgotten, how the powerful escape accountability. The Atlanta child cases are still open, whether the city admits it or not. The questions are still unanswered. And somewhere, in a prison cell, in a grieving mother's heart, in the archives of evidence that may never see daylight, the truth is waiting. I'm Julian Cross, and this has been the Midnight File. Until next time, remember, every file tells a story, but not every story gets told the way it should. Good night.